They began through forming a shared conceptual language that we built over time that then grew into the architectural ideas. My name's Kim Bridgland. I'm one of two directors at Edition Office Architects.
Aaron Roberts, co-director of Edition Office.
I guess we describe it in different terms amongst ourselves, but we're very acutely aware that architecture exists within a spectrum of social, cultural contexts. And the clarity of that relationship, or the clarity of the design response to enable the architecture to be situated with some distinction in that relationship is vital, and that seems to be a defining attribute that we seek to incorporate into all of our work.
The conceptual approach, or the parti, is fundamental to all of our projects, and the way it relates to the social and cultural aspects of particular designs from the office. It's a way of clarifying and distilling the intent of the design relative to whatever particular social or cultural issue that we're engaging with through that particular project. We find that the clarification of that intent directly relates back to the formal and spatial and material attributes of a particular project and the way it's situated on a site. But we are interested in that idea that people engaging with our work do so through their own particular cultural lens and their own particular reading of a project.
In kind of a particular built example, I know this language is relatively abstract. In Absence, the 2019 NGV Architecture Commission we designed with Iwani Scarce, or with For Our Country, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander War Memorial we designed with Daniel Boyd. Both of those projects were acutely related to narrative and acutely related to specific cultural engagement between Indigenous culture and Indigenous knowledge, understanding of Indigenous recognition of memory and sacrifice and connection to country, that the architecture couldn't be overloaded and compromised by too easily understood, visual narratives. So the visual references or the form of the architecture couldn't give the game away. It couldn't kind of erode or simplify, I guess, the large weight of meaning and relationship that very different people were going to have to that building. So we sought to, as much as possible, to find a formal language that was not visually so easily recognizable, but that demanded you engage with it on your own terms, and you engage with it phenomenologically in real time and in real space, and formed your own understanding of it through your relationship to it.
With Iwani Scarce and with Daniel Boyd, we felt it was very important that they were involved in the design process from the beginning. We were able to take those learnings and translate them into a design process which was collaborative and richer because of the shared dialogue and shared design intent in those projects.
We don't design by testing out 12, 50, 100 different formal options and then finding the one that we think feels or looks the best. I think how we approach a design challenge is by context analysis, and that means site analysis, but that means context in a very broad sense, the cultural context, and we unpick that and we find out, what does this architectural outcome need to do? How does it need to perform? How does it need to meet its complex requirements? First of all, what are those requirements? And we distill those, and we try and distill an architectural response that solves them in as efficient manner as possible. And that allows a number of different things. It allows us to not get stuck in a way of visually thinking or aesthetically thinking. It allows us to challenge ideas and to generate new aesthetic ideas or formal ideas that are relevant to the goal that we're trying to, the ambition of the project, rather than having a visual or an aesthetic idea first and then trying to shoehorn that back into the requirements of the project. It's another crucial element to this idea of parti or concept, and having clarity in that at the beginning of a project to enable built outcome to hold on to those conceptual ideas that you regard as incredibly important. Having clarity in concept and being able to articulate that to yourself and articulate that to your design team and your client right at the beginning of the project is so important to enable you to go through that long and arduous process and come out with a building that has the rigor that you're trying to commit to right at the end.
And the sort of distillation of that idea and the design intent and that concept in the first phase gives you a reference to go back to and say to yourself, does this threshold, does this movement from one room to another, does this window detail, does this materiality reinforce that design intent? Does it amplify that design intent in a way which is supportive of the original idea? And documenting and making these conceptual tools for us helps us go back to that, helps us kind of reinforce those decisions and clarifies those decisions as we move through the design process.
It's so important that those concepts or that sense of parti is not for its own sake. It's to serve the purposes, the functional and the programmatic and the experiential purposes that you're endeavouring to create or manifest in the architecture. Our Hawthorn House, for example, it's a kind of suburban house in it's a relatively small block, but we wanted as much as possible to create the feeling you get and the freedom you get in a remote and regional project where the house can expand and drift and flow out to the landscape around it. The conceptual design response to enable these was to set up these pavilions with this arched aperture, and the purpose of the arched aperture was to enable a blink of view to kind of contain your gaze and just kind of hold it down to be within that garden space, and to also allow a lightness, a sense that the building wasn't weighted down and heavy upon you, that there was a lightness as if you were sitting under the canopy of a large fig tree and were able to walk in and underneath that. And the other way we were able to enable that sense of ease or informality between the inside and outdoor spaces was to clarify all of the functional elements are all held in this one singular solid band that unifies the rear pavilion and the front pavilion, or they hold all of the function to allow the living spaces to be unencumbered from that. And then dragging this exterior concrete skin of the project and bringing it up as a solid entity on the first floor, by blocking the long distance views horizontally, we're able to engage every single one of those sleeping bathing spaces with its own private courtyard, which is full of plants. And it allows this wonderful sense of informality and openness between very private indoor spaces to these open air gardens.
In relation to collaboration, the fundamental idea around that is that the person or group that you're collaborating with influence the design process, and we feel that it's very important when we do collaborate that influence happens at the beginning of a project and helps to shape the design intent of the particular project.
I think collaborations are really interesting in that to work effectively, they require a profound level of letting go. They require a very specific relationship of trust. They began through forming a shared conceptual language that we built over time that then grew into the architectural ideas. I think architecture is always a cultural act. It's always a political act. It's always a level of discourse, whether it's acute discourse or not. It is always part of a greater conversation. And so part of collaborations with people outside the field.
The fundamental kind of value in collaboration in many ways is to enrich and diversify your practice, diversify the ways in which you think about particular social or cultural issues, or even when it comes down to just purely thinking about how a space might be used in relation to a particular user group.
I think I know the difficulties of that in that university space. When they work well, I think you need to have an awareness of your own position, and a kind of clarity on your own ideas allows you to be relaxed and loose and allows you to let go. Because the most important thing or the most interesting thing about a collaborative relationship is that you end up in a place that you didn't foresee at the beginning. You end up at a place that neither one of you could have delivered on your own, and you find this third entity which is richer for it, which is opens up new design ideas or new ways of thinking or new ways of relating to the task, because it comes from that more developed, complex way of addressing it that is seen from multiple vantage points.
I think in a university context, much of the idea around collaborating in small teams and so forth is in some ways about sharing knowledge, and in other ways preparing graduates for the realities of working and practice outside of the university. So in many ways, learning tools of communication and tools of dialogue and ways of crystallizing dialogue between different parties is as much a skill that is a prerequisite to being a great designer as is being able to design a beautiful form.
I think there's a number of parts to that, and clarifying things with diagrams is incredibly important. Building models is incredibly important. We communicate our projects in a whole bunch of different ways in order to show different aspects of the house. Every building is understood in so many different ways. I suppose we use verbal language, written language, floor plans, massing diagrams. All of those help to communicate the idea, and they're all kind of relative to the situation. But we also use diagrams or different communication methods, be it photographs, diagrams, plans, models, and that's to highlight the different vantage points or the different gazes that it's seen from. The same piece of architecture is understood in very different ways. It's seen as an incredibly mute, simple figure ground party diagram, a sectional diagram or a plan diagram. Is the house a cloister? Is the house an island? Is the house a wall? What is the main driver that's progressing its spatial relationships? We try and document in a fairly unromantic or unidealized sense the context and the landscape that it situates within. We produce models that are not necessarily figurative representations of the building. They're more emotional or material gestures. It takes a long time for the project to be built, and it's very important to have that haptic response to the atmosphere or the feeling that the project might bring forward that can't be communicated in CAD or vectorial drawings or orthographic drawings.
We catalogue our work and document our work in a very particular way, whether it be a site photograph, as Kim pointed out, or a model or a diagram. And in many ways, that cataloguing serves a dual purpose. It serves a scenario in which we can view and catalogue and understand the relationships between various projects that we create for ourselves. And when there's decisions or questions to be made around a project, we can relate back to those and make sure that they're reinforcing that design intent. The other purpose is to capture particular essential qualities of a project and reflect them back to the client. So as Kim pointed out, the physical models represent potentially a materiality or a physicality or a sort of experiential quality that can't necessarily be evoked through the other documentary tools.
Part of that cataloguing or that archive is also a way of seeing residual patterns that emerge and that are repeated. We're very interested in so many complex ideas can be solved architecturally through really rudimentary outcomes. We see our projects coming back down to like less than half a dozen resolutions. You might solve a relationship with a wall or a cloister. This idea of just very fundamental and very elemental spatial or tectonic arrangements are the backbone for architecture, and often they can be that reductive. Architecture doesn't exist within a vacuum. It doesn't exist within this purely architectural lens. Architecture exists within a context of complexity. It exists within a world of this economic, this social world with profound inequalities. It exists within an environmental and ecological world. So I think as an architecture student, be a person engaged with the world first and then become an architect. Fold your relationship and your engagement with your own life and the people around you and the context that you exist within. Learn from that, understand that, and apply that thinking in your architecture, not the other way around.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And I think the other thing to think about is engaging with architecture through a lens which excites you and enables you to have the energy to carry through the very long and protracted career path of an architect. And I guess it's about finding whatever mode that it really excites you about production or in life, and then pushing that through an architectural lens, whether that be model making, or it's important to have that level of energy to carry you through.